Welcome to the Legal File. I am going to be your host today, and I'm going to be introducing the usual host, Mr. Charles Parselle. He is an attorney and he's a mediator, and we're going to be talking about mediation and negotiation. He's been a well-respected mediator for many years and has been an attorney for over 40 years, both as an English barrister and as a California attorney. So, hello, Charles. This
Hello.
is your show, but today I'm hosting for you.
Thanks very much. People are obviously very surprised to hear that I've been an attorney for over 40 years. I certainly don't look it. Would you agree with that?
You look very young.
Yeah, but today I hope we're going to have an interesting conversation about negotiation.
So tell me, what is negotiation?
Well, the essential difference, if you get into a fight with someone, it is possible to get that dispute, whatever you want to call it, resolved without ever talking to that person. For example, you can go to war with them, or you can file a legal case. So if you file a legal case, A versus B, B and A never have to talk. They can address all their comments to the person who's going to make the decision, which will be a judge or a jury. Right. They never actually have to get together. But if you're negotiating, then you, as a minimum, you have to talk to someone. You really have to talk to the other person. Now, often we have a new profession really called mediator, where people get to negotiate with each other without having to talk to each other very much, because they talk to the mediator instead. Mm-hmm. So you can have a bilateral discussion between A and B with a mediator simply facilitating the discussion. That's not uncommon. Or you can have a discussion where A is in one room, B is in another room, and the mediator is essentially the person that's being, to whom they're communicating and who's relaying communications. Well, that's quite different style than a straightforward
fight. Well, even in small claims court, they want you to mediate. They want you, before the judge lets you go further, they want to put you out in the hall and have you talk and communicate and mediate with the other party.
Yes, they do. They absolutely do.
So it's an integral part of the court system.
It's not, actually. They do quite often. I know this because I have sat as a small claims judge for 12 years at least. So I'm very familiar that someone makes a pitch saying, oh, you can mediate your case. But a lot of people would say, no thanks, we don't want to talk. We'd rather just pitch our case to the judge. And so I take the bench and they say, the plaintiff says, this is my claim, and the defense says, this is my defense, and the judge makes a decision. So yes, it's true that attempts have been made to integrate.
Do you think that mediation back in history, it was probably more common, and then it went away for a long time, and now it's come back as a profession? Because, back in history, people used to communicate more and talk more, and there was more interaction, I think, in communities and between individuals, and when there were hostilities, they were ironed out more, in person with each other. So you think it's kind of an attempt to bring back what we used to have? No,
not really. I think it's been going on. These two styles have been going in lockstep throughout history. There's always been a lot of wars in history, a lot of disputes. And there's also been, if you look at a mediator simply as a go-between, I think that's a very good definition. Yes, there have always been mediators. Now we have it formalized and people go to university and get a master's in dispute resolution. But you're quite right. Now we can go back to the 2nd century BC, and we find the plays of the Greek playwright Menander, which is always in the context of lovers' quarrels, boy-girl difficulties. They use a go-between. Often it's said to be a wily slave who goes between the two. But country house farces, Victorian country house farces, 18th century plays, always go-between. So yeah, it's not new.
I bet you have some interesting stories as a mediator, as a negotiator.
Well, everything can be divided into the human side, the very personal, wounded side on the one hand, and then the hard-boiled negotiation on the other. And often you get those two in the same. So I did a mediation not very long ago where someone had felt terribly wounded by something that had happened to a family member in hospital. And that matter had dragged on for 18 months before someone had the bright idea of coming to me. Did that sound quite right? Maybe not.
Yes. So, it's always a bright idea to come to you.
There you go. So the person in question was extremely upset, even after 18 months of trying to get this situation
So this person
resolved.
in the hospital had been wronged or injured by the other party in their view, and therefore they were...
No, not at all.
Oh, so
someone had died,
Uh-huh.
and this was a family member who was terribly, terribly upset. Well, we know one can really understand that. But the thing had dragged on for so very long. Well, they also wanted to negotiate a settlement, but it couldn't be done. So it couldn't be done until the emotional wound had been addressed, which took a long time, many, many, many hours. And then... Did
they feel the death was because the death had to do with what this other person had done, or it was not related to that?
Well, it really doesn't matter. So I'm not going to tell you the facts because you don't need to know.
Okay.
It doesn't help with the story. Well, the point I want to make is that it is possible to get an emotional catharsis. It's possible to resolve, a wound that has been existing for a long time. That's a long-standing wound. Then an attempt was made to negotiate the money. It's a very bad idea. I said, no, this bad idea. Come back another day. Why? Because you have to wait. You have to wait to let it, to let it subside. Then you can come down and talk about, then you can come and talk about the money. But the money is a complete change of gear, isn't it? They did try to talk about the money. I said, it's not going to work. And they tried, and it didn't work. Then they wanted to go. And then I said, no, you should have listened to me in the first place. Come back another day, make a date. So they did.
Are some people not emotional, or are most people just, it's like everybody emotional about this, or are some people just in there, I just want the money and I'm not upset, I don't care, I don't have any feelings of anger towards the other party. It's just cold, hard cash, and that's what matters to me.
Oh, yeah, the answer is, very, very frequently. Well, everyone is emotional, but the emotions don't always come out. So, for the most part, when you're just doing a straightforward negotiation, then it's the tactics of the negotiation. And so, somebody wants money, and somebody does not want to pay money, but recognizes that they may have to. So the mistakes can be made, and they're always tactical mistakes. The biggest mistake that can be made is not knowing your bottom line. You have to know what you want. So I say this is, you have to know what you're willing to die for. Fortunately not in this case, literally die for, but what's your walkaway point? So if you don't settle, if you don't make a deal, then the thing goes forward into time, doesn't it? It can escalate, it can get worse, it can certainly get more expensive. It's not over. The benefits of something being resolved are very great indeed. People, you'd be surprised they don't really know what they want. Why? Because they're living in illusion. It's not, they don't say to themselves, what can I live with here in order to be able to get on with my life? They say, what do I really want? No, it's not. So they always think that they're going to get more than the situation will allow.
Do their attorneys kind of make them feel that way, or do they set them into what is reality?
Sometimes the attorney has his or her own illusions. So you never know. You can't tell.
Right.
And sometimes people are realistic. If they're really realistic, they might not need a mediator at all. But no one's that realistic. It's impossible. If it's you, if it's your wants and desires, it's very hard to be realistic.
When my child support, I negotiated it with my daughter's father, and we were able to do it, and it was very peaceful, and it worked out just fine.
I think that's completely accurate, and I would say, let's say there are millions and millions of negotiations that occur every day. From the one end of the country to the other.
That's true.
Nearly everything is done bilaterally. That means people just do it themselves. They just talk it out.
Right.
So we're only talking about a small class of situations where people just can't do that.
Well, they've probably already tried to work it out in some way, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, even if it wasn't a direct, you know, conversation, they probably tried to somehow demand some sort of compensation, and the other person said no in some form, in order to get to the point where they actually come to you and need some official mediation services.
That's true. So you could say nobody would come to someone like me unless they were already at an impasse.
Right.
Because why would you? You'd always try to work it out. So you're not going to go, if you're injured, if you cut your finger, your first reaction is not to go to the hospital. Your first reaction is to clean the wound and bandage it.
Right.
It's only if that doesn't work you're going to take it to the next step, right? We always try to, of course, that is completely true.
Well, I understand there are different types of situations for mediation. So you have like buying and selling. Is that one of the various types? You had written out some things you specifically had categorized it as buying and selling, divorce, business, and accident.
Look, a normal negotiation is always involves buying and selling. People are buying and selling all the time. Sometimes the price is, I mean, mostly in our society the price is fixed. Mm-hmm. If you want to get, and yet it's not, is it? Let's say you want to buy, I don't know, a DVD, television, whatever. Well, you're the buyer. You're going to look at the various vendors, aren't you? You know, can we get it? The vendors are then competing against each other to get your business. Why? Because televisions are a kind of generic product. You can get a television, you know, same make of television. You may be able to get in 5 different outlets. You're only interested in the price. But there are lots of situations where people actually negotiate one-on-one in order to determine the best price. What about a house? You know, houses go on offer. It's not a fixed price.
Right.
Buyers will always negotiate the price of a house and try to get it as cheap as they can. Now, as we know, it's a buyer's market. Sellers, you know, houses prices are going down. But 3 years ago, it was a seller's market. Prices were going up. So that type of thing is very obvious to most people, but most people aren't very good at that. I mean, you see that in a big way in buying and selling a car. When you buy a car, you're always at a disadvantage because car salesmen, because you buy a car once every 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years, however often you buy a car, you'd have to be buying, you know, several a week in order to be able to compete with the expertise of a car salesman, because they do it all the time. So
that's why they have something called the fax attack.
I know. Yes, that's right.
And you send in, you research exactly what other people have paid for the car, and you send your faxes out. Well, I was trying to say for the audience.
I know you were indeed, but we're not allowed to mention the name.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, I'm just saying the fax attack is sending it out, and then the different dealerships tell you, yes, I can pay that price, or this is the best price I can give you for this exact car with these amenities, and then you know where to go, and you've already got your financing secured. So you walk in the door, you've already got it all settled. You know that's the lowest price, and that's the way you have an upper hand.
Exactly. No, that's very good. Well, that's exactly the same as research. I mean, right around here, as we know, there are, if you want to buy an appliance, there are lots of places you can go. There are at least 6 places you can go. And you can go online, or you can go into the store and see who's got the best price. What you're saying is exactly the same. Instead of going to the dealership to negotiate one-on-one, you in effect get all the dealerships to
compete against each other.
And you just take the lowest price. Yeah. So we find this in divorces. People, you can sleep with someone in the same bed for 20 years, and then you want to get divorced and you find you can't talk to them. It's a tragic situation. That's why people go to lawyers, and the lawyers will talk to each other and they'll ask the judge to make a decision, but the husband and wife don't have to talk to each other. If they, that way.
So that's pretty common, you find, and when you're mediating divorces, you find that there's definitely a communication breakdown between the two people?
No. As a prerequisite to mediate, they have to be able to talk to each other. They can't have gone so far that they won't talk to each other, because unless they're willing to have some communication with each other, you just can't mediate it. It's just too difficult. And I suppose theoretically you could.
I mean, they could, because one could talk to you, and then the other could talk to you, and you could go back and forth and relay messages and try to negotiate it that way. But it would be time-consuming and probably very difficult.
Well, it's certainly possible to do it that way, but at least they must have got on sufficiently to be able to agree that this is the way to go. So there's got to be some minimal level of communication. However, the expense is very, 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 very much reduced if you go to mediation.
Right.
I did one not very long ago. I was told that the person had been divorced twice. I was doing the second divorce, which cost about $10,000. Not nothing, but the first divorce had cost over $300,000.
Wow.
That's a very big difference.
It is.
And that's talking about people with a lot of money, who have a great many affairs that need to be disentangled and sorted out. Most people aren't going to spend that kind of money getting divorced. But when you consider that you can get married for $75,
that's true.
I think it's $75 now. No questions asked, city clerk, thank you very much. Congratulations, state of California is pleased to recognize your marriage. But to get divorced, you have to file a petition in court. The very first step costs you $320, and it doesn't stop there. So getting divorced is a lot more expensive than getting married.
Right, right. What about doing business-type mediations?
You know, that is mostly about money. But anything that has not been resolved has a reason for that. And if the end result is going to be a dollar figure, and yet they haven't been able to work out a dollar figure, something must be in the way of that of that, mustn't it? So it could either be an emotional thing, which is very often now. Some people are just emotional. That's easy. Actually, that's quite easy to deal with. Some people are emotional but don't see emotion in themselves, and it's hidden. And then, there's a barrier that it's an unknown unknown, isn't it? They don't know that this is the barrier. That's more tricky. Now, even if it's not emotional, you do have the problem of illusion, which I think is a very good word, because if one person says 150 and one person says 25, they can't both be right. One of them has clearly got it wrong. The likelihood is that they both got it wrong. Why? Why would they get it wrong? Well, because...
Well, it's a subjective thing anyway, and it's just a matter of what someone's willing to pay and what someone's willing to take. So there is no real number, what I would argue. I mean, am I right?
Well, clearly you're wrong. Clearly you're wrong because once a number has been arrived at, that's the number. It's true, you might not know the number, except looking back.
But if it was an hour later and different factors had occurred, and one person was tireder or one person had a burst of energy, the number would probably come out different. Just because that's the number at 2 o'clock doesn't mean that would be the number at 3 or that would be the number at 1. It's still a subjective situation, and the number is a subjective number that's just been, arrived at by a negotiation.
That's partly true. Numbers are not entirely subjective. There has to be some objectivity to a number. What you're correctly saying is that the number, it's not an exact number, but normally it has to be within a range. Because
in a jury, like a jury goes to deliberate a case, they're not able to be told anything about what amount should be awarded. They're not told, oh, well, we have 10 cases here and these are all similar precedents, and therefore you should look at these cases and these amounts awarded. So therefore you get a situation like the McDonald's case, which I'll mention just because, and this huge amount of money is awarded for a burned mouth with a coffee cup. And, so you have different types of awards, and, it's all based on whatever happens in that jury room, and it's not based on any sort of, oh, this is the amount that person should receive. And I would assume mediation is the same way, where...
Well, based on your theory, you would think that it's all entirely random. But in reality, it's not random. It's not that random. These things go on a bell curve. So you do find that, certain things go for certain values. And the values values may vary within a range, maybe a 20% range, which could be that's quite a lot, but it's not dramatic. It's not completely random.
There
are cases. what you might call runaway cases that you hear about.
Right.
Actually, you never hear about them on the low end. So there are situations where the number was 0, and they don't get reported in the newspapers, but where that was a horribly unjust result. And there are other cases at the other end where,
right.
Obviously the McDonald case is probably the most famous case in history.
But if there are ranges, where can an average person who perhaps has some kind of an injury or whatever, maybe how can they look this up and say, this is the range I should be looking in or thinking about?
The answer is there's no place they can look that up. There are places where you can look up jury verdicts, sure. It's called verdicts and judgments. There are books.
I mean, are they easy for the layperson, or are they complicated and only for lawyers really to use to review cases and to kind of estimate what they are going to be getting for a particular case?
Well, I think even for lawyers they're quite complicated because every case is, obviously the facts are every case has different facts.
Right.
And yet, you can discern, it gives you some kind of a clue. You can discern values running through those jury verdicts. But in order to determine value, you really have to be in a profession. So the legal profession is good, quite good, sometimes quite good, sometimes not very good at arriving at value within its own area of expertise. But what about someone who's in the business of breeding racehorses? You know, racehorses are a very tricky thing to buy, very risky thing, potentially a very high reward thing to buy. How would you possibly know that? The answer is you don't know that unless you're in the business, but it's exactly the same.
Well,
it's buying a house. You're a realtor.
Right.
So realtors have a much better idea of value than the layperson does. So you sign up a client, you get a listing from a client, they say, they routinely want a lot more than you know that house is going to sell for. Am I right?
Frequently, yes.
That's frequently. So you have to say, you know.
But of course you do have comps, so you do have somewhere they can look and they can say, these are the solds in the neighborhood, and therefore there is some hard information that they can access in order to determine
That's very
what
true.
the value is,
That's
or what
very true.
it's likely to sell for.
Especially with houses, because you know there are localities, aren't there? One location is different than another location, so you're immediately keyed in by the location and then by the square footage of the house and the amenities. So
right.
Houses are far more generic than many things. Now, loaves of bread are much more generic than houses are, I will agree. But legal cases are often one-offs.
Well, I remember with some of the legal cases you did in the past, I was able to participate with you in mock trials, which was really interesting because we get a group of people together and present two sides of a case. You would present one side and I would present the other side, and then the guests would pretend to be jurors and they would come up with what they thought that case was worth, or what they would award or what they wouldn't award, as far as what their verdict would be. And it was kind of interesting. There was some pretty big discrepancies sometimes in those little juries as far as what they thought the value of a particular case was.
Oh, I agree. I agree, and in fact, I had a big case, and I asked a lot of people what they thought the case was worth, and the highest one I think I got was $75 million, and the lowest one
was zero.
That's a very
that's a lot of difference.
And I can't remember if it was 75 million or only 50 million, but really only 50 or zero. That's a very big difference. But even in that case, you could see, the way the negotiation went, not a very good way to negotiate. They start off with hugely far apart. You don't really, with a big situation, you don't really know what's going to happen until the pressure is on. You know that expression that says, nothing concentrates a man's mind like knowing he's about to be hanged.
I haven't heard that, but
no,
now I have.
Oh, well, I think the great Dr. Johnson said that, I believe. Now, here we have a situation where when the pressure really goes on, then people start to focus very intently on it, and lots of different brains are working on this problem, and that tends to shed illusions, as I call them. Now we see this right now. The big three Detroit automakers again are on have gone to.
They're asking for more money now than last time when they flew on their jet. Now they drive their little cars to D.C. and now they want 11 million more or something.
11 million.
11 billion more. Yeah.
So, but everyone's really focusing in on the problem. That is the essence of mediation, I think, is that where you have quite a few people all thinking about the same thing at the same time, then a result comes out that people can live with. And that's, the most, a wonderful result. You get very strange things happen. Very intransigent people. I'm thinking of a very intransigent man who was Italian, and he was an Italian-American. I only mention this because he was completely in the wrong, 100%. And they said to me, I just walked in the room, solve it. So what could I do? Answer nothing. I could just talk to the guy. So I talk about Italy. I've been in Italy. I've had many pleasant experiences in Italy. I was very happy to relive my past in Italy with this gentleman who was very charming. He was just intransigent, and he was happy to talk to me. Then we talked about cars, we talked about this, we talked about that, and in the other room they were saying, what's going on? I said, it's going great. In the end, what happened was he said to me, well, what do you think? Do you think I'm being unreasonable? I said, yeah, you're being unreasonable. He said, what should I do? I said, well, and you've got to remove those things from where they are. And he said, you're right. Now, that was simply as a result of 3 hours of pleasantry, really.
We have to wrap up now.
We're going to wrap up.
And I want to thank you for joining us on The Legal File, and it was an honor interviewing Mr. Parselle, the host of The Legal File. So he will see you next time, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I've had a very good time being interviewed. I don't know how.